The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street of Bozeman, Montana Territory, as Margaret Grace stood before the mirror in the small room behind the First Presbyterian Church, her hands trembling as she smoothed the ivory silk of her wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. The year was 1883, and she had waited 23 years to feel this way, to be a bride, to finally escape the lonely existence of being the unmarried daughter in a frontier town where women were scarce and expectations were high. Her mother had passed 5 years ago, and her father, a stern banker named William Grace, had insisted she marry Richard Thornton, the son of his business partner, a man who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Richard was handsome enough, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly wrong for her in every way that mattered. But Margaret had convinced herself that love would grow with time, that duty and companionship were enough to build a life upon. The church bells chimed 9 o'clock, and Margaret's best friend Sarah rushed into the room, her face pale as milk, her eyes wide with something that looked terribly like pity. Margaret felt her stomach drop even before Sarah spoke, even before the words tumbled out in a rush of breath and sorrow. Richard was not coming. He had left town the night before with Catherine Mills, the daughter of the general store owner, a girl barely 19 years old with golden curls and a laugh like silver bells. They had taken 2 horses and enough supplies to make it to California, where Richard's brother owned a ranch and would no doubt welcome them with open arms and no questions asked. The note Richard had left with his father was brief and brutal in its honesty. He loved Catherine, had loved her for months, and could not go through with a marriage based on business arrangements and family expectations. Margaret stood perfectly still as Sarah delivered this news, her mind unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The church was full of people, over 100 guests who had traveled from all over the territory to witness this union. Her father had spent a fortune on the reception, on the food and the music, and the decorations that turned the church social hall into something resembling a palace ballroom. The dress she wore had been ordered from San Francisco, had taken 6 months to arrive, and cost more than most families in Bozeman earned in a year. And now, in the space of a heartbeat, it had all become meaningless, a monument to her humiliation and his betrayal. Sarah was crying now, holding Margaret's hands and saying something about how Richard was a fool, how any man would be lucky to have her, how this was not her fault and she should hold her head high. But Margaret barely heard the words. She could only think about walking out into that church, facing all those people, seeing the pity in their eyes and the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life. She would be the woman who was not good enough, the bride who was abandoned, the girl no man wanted badly enough to actually marry. In a place like Montana Territory, where women were still outnumbered by men nearly 3 to 1, being left at the altar was more than humiliating. It was incomprehensible. Margaret pulled her hands free from Sarah's grip and walked to the small window that looked out onto the side yard of the church. She needed air, needed to breathe, needed to think about anything other than the disaster unfolding around her. Through the wavy glass, she could see a man leaning against the white picket fence that separated the church property from the livery stable next door. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim trousers and a faded blue shirt, a brown leather vest that had seen better days, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. A horse stood beside him, a beautiful paint mare with intelligent eyes and a patient stance. The man was smoking a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the clear morning sky, and something about his posture suggested he was waiting for something, though Margaret could not imagine what business he might have at the church on this particular morning. Sarah had gone to fetch Margaret's father, to deliver the news and figure out what to do about the guests who were growing restless in the sanctuary. Margaret knew she should stay in the room, should wait for her father to tell her what to do, but she found herself moving toward the door instead, her feet carrying her down the narrow hallway and out the side entrance before her mind could catch up with her actions. The morning air was cool against her flushed cheeks, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to think clearly through the fog of shock and humiliation that clouded her thoughts. The cowboy looked up as she emerged from the church, and she saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in her wedding dress, the elaborate lace and silk, and the veil that trailed behind her like a white shadow. He pushed his hat back and straightened up, grinding out his cigarette beneath his boot heel, and Margaret realized with a start that she recognized him. His name was Phillip Anderson, and he worked as a horse breaker and trainer for several of the ranches around Bozeman. She had seen him in town occasionally, had noticed him the way any woman would notice a man who moved with that kind of easy confidence and quiet strength. But they had never spoken beyond basic pleasantries. He tipped his hat to her now, a gesture of respect that seemed oddly formal given her current state of dishevelment and obvious distress. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, the color of storm clouds over the mountains, and they held a warmth and kindness that made something in Margaret's chest tighten painfully. "Morning, Miss Grace," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by river water. "I hope I am not intruding. I was just waiting on Reverend Matthews to finish up here so I could talk to him about a matter, but I can see this might not be the best time." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, to tell him that yes, this was very much not the best time, that her entire life had just collapsed around her ears, and she needed to be alone. But instead, what came out was a strangled sob, followed by another, and then she was crying in earnest, great gasping tears that she had been holding back since Sarah had delivered the news. She pressed her hands to her face, mortified by this display of weakness in front of a virtual stranger, but unable to stop the flood of emotion that overwhelmed her. She heard Philip move closer, heard him say something in that low, gentle voice, and then she felt his hands on her shoulders, steady and sure, guiding her away from the church door and over to a wooden bench beneath a cottonwood tree that provided some privacy from the street. He sat her down and then lowered himself beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence, solid and reassuring in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. "I take it the wedding is not going as planned," he said after a moment, and there was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet understanding that made Margaret want to cry even harder. "He left," she managed to say through her tears. "He ran away with another woman, last night. He is gone and everyone is inside waiting, and I have to go tell them all that I was not enough, that he chose someone else, that I am the pathetic fool who thought she could actually be happy." Philip was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was tight with anger, though Margaret sensed it was not directed at her. "Any man who would do that to a woman on her wedding day is not worth the tears you are shedding for him. He is a coward and a fool, and you are well rid of him." Margaret lowered her hands and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was probably around 30 years old, with sun-bronzed skin and lines around his eyes that spoke of long days working outdoors. His jaw was strong and shadowed with stubble, and his mouth was set in a grim line that suggested he took no pleasure in seeing anyone suffer. There was something inherently decent about him, something that made her want to believe his words even though her heart was too broken to accept them fully. "You are kind to say so," she said softly. "But it changes nothing. I still have to face those people. I still have to endure the pity and the whispers and the knowledge that everyone in Bozeman will be talking about this for years to come." Philip frowned, his gaze shifting to the church door and then back to her face. "What if you did not have to face them? What if you just left?" Margaret blinked at him, confused. "Left? I cannot just leave. My father is in there, my friends, everyone I know. I have to go explain what happened, have to apologize for wasting their time." "Why?" Philip asked, and his bluntness startled her. "Why do you have to apologize for something that was not your fault? Why do you have to stand there and let them look at you like you are some kind of curiosity or tragedy? You did not do anything wrong, Miss Grace." "He did. And if you walk back in there right now, you are giving him even more power over your life than he has already taken." Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. The idea of simply leaving, of walking away from the mess and the humiliation and all those waiting people, was so foreign to her that she could barely comprehend it. She had spent her entire life doing what was expected of her, following the rules, meeting other people's expectations. The thought of just abandoning all of that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. "Where would I go?" she asked, and even as she said the words, she knew she was considering it, actually considering running away from her own wedding. Philip stood up and held out his hand to her. "I have a small ranch about 15 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, just a cabin and a barn and enough land to raise horses. You could come there, stay for a few days until things settle down, until you figure out what you want to do next. I can promise you will be safe and no one will bother you or make you talk about things you do not want to discuss." Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong, offering her an escape she had not even known she wanted. She thought about her father in the church, about how angry he would be, how humiliated. She thought about all the guests waiting for a wedding that would never happen, about the food and the flowers and the waste of it all. She thought about Richard riding toward California with Catherine in his arms, laughing about how he had escaped a marriage he never wanted in the first place. And then she thought about herself, about what she wanted, about what she deserved, and she made a decision that surprised even her. She placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. "Take me away from here," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Please, I cannot go back in there, I just cannot." Philip's face softened and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Can you ride in that dress?" Margaret looked down at the elaborate gown, at the yards of silk and lace that would make mounting a horse nearly impossible. "Not well," she admitted, "but I can try." He thought for a moment, then nodded toward his paint mare. "Molly here is gentle as a lamb. I will ride behind you and make sure you do not fall, but we need to move quickly before someone comes looking for you." Margaret did not let herself think about it anymore. She let Philip help her onto the horse, bunching the heavy skirts as best she could, and then he swung up behind her with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back, steadying her, anchoring her to this moment and this decision. He made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, and Molly started walking, carrying them away from the church, away from the waiting crowd, away from the life Margaret had thought she wanted. They rode through the back streets of Bozeman, avoiding the main thoroughfares where people might see them and ask questions. Margaret kept her veil pulled forward, hiding her face, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Philip could feel it. She had never done anything like this in her entire life, had never been reckless or impulsive or brave. But somehow, sitting on this horse with this stranger who had offered her kindness when she needed it most, she felt more herself than she had in years. Once they left the town behind, Philip urged Molly into a canter, and Margaret held onto the saddle horn with both hands, the wind whipping her veil behind her like a banner. The landscape opened up around them, rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, the Bridger Mountains rising in the distance like sentinels guarding the valley. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that only existed in Montana. And for the first time since Sarah had walked into that room with her terrible news, Margaret felt like she could breathe again. They rode for over an hour, the sun climbing higher in the sky, warming the air and turning the grass golden. Philip did not try to make conversation, for which Margaret was grateful. She needed the silence, needed time to think, to process what had happened and what she had just done. Running away solved nothing, she knew that. She would still have to face her father eventually, would still have to deal with the aftermath of this disaster. But for now, for these few hours, she could pretend that none of it mattered, that she was just a woman on a horse, riding toward something new and unknown. Philip's ranch appeared on the horizon just as Margaret was beginning to feel truly uncomfortable in the saddle, her legs aching and her back stiff from the unfamiliar position. It was modest, as he had said, just a small log cabin with a covered porch, a good-sized barn, and several corrals holding horses of various colors and sizes. The property was nestled against a line of cottonwood trees that marked the path of a creek, and the whole place had a peaceful, well-tended quality that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Philip dismounted first, then helped Margaret down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her carefully from the saddle. Her legs were shaky when her feet touched the ground, and she stumbled slightly, but he steadied her with a gentle grip on her elbow. "Easy now," he said. "You are not used to riding like that. Come inside and sit down. I will get you some water and we can figure out what comes next." Margaret followed him into the cabin, her elaborate wedding dress looking absurdly out of place in the rough-hewn interior. The space was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and a door that led to what she assumed was a bedroom. There were books on a shelf, a pair of worn boots by the door, and a rifle mounted over the fireplace. It was a man's space, unadorned and practical, but it felt safe in a way that her father's grand house never had. Philip pulled out a chair for her at the table and went to pump water from the sink, filling a tin cup and bringing it to her. Margaret drank gratefully, realizing she was parched, and then set the cup down with a slightly shaky hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I know this is strange and probably inappropriate, and I promise I will not impose on your hospitality for long. I just needed to get away, needed some time to think." Philip sat down across from her, his long legs stretched out under the table, his expression serious but not unkind. "You are not imposing, and for what it is worth, I think you did the right thing." Walking away from that mess was braver than facing it would have been. Margaret shook her head. "I do not feel brave. I feel like a coward. My father will be furious. He probably already has people out looking for me." "Let him be furious," Philip said with a shrug. "From what I have heard around town, your father cared more about that wedding as a business arrangement than as a celebration of your happiness. Maybe it is time he learned that you are a person with your own thoughts and feelings, not just a bargaining chip in his dealings." His words struck a chord deep in Margaret's chest because they were true, painfully true. Her father had never once asked her if she loved Richard, had never cared about whether she would be happy in the marriage. All he had cared about was strengthening his business ties and securing his financial future. She had been a means to an end, nothing more. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted, her voice small. "I have no money of my own, nowhere to go." I am completely dependent on my father's goodwill, and after this, I doubt he will have much of that to spare." Philip leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his gray-blue eyes serious. "You can stay here as long as you need. I have a spare room. Nothing fancy, but it is private and clean. You can have time to figure out what you want, to make a plan that is yours and no one else's. I will not touch you or bother you or expect anything from you. You have my word on that." Margaret met his gaze and saw only honesty there, only a simple desire to help someone in need. She barely knew this man, had no reason to trust him, and yet something deep in her gut told her that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man trying to do the right thing. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "You do not know me. You have no obligation to help me." Philip was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant, and when he spoke, his voice was soft with old pain. "5 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar situation. Not quite the same, but close enough. She was engaged to a man who seemed decent on the surface, but who turned out to be cruel and violent. She tried to call off the wedding, but our father would not hear of it, said she had given her word and had to honor it. She married that man because she thought she had no choice, and he made her life hell for 2 years before she finally found the courage to leave him. By then, the damage was done. She is living in Denver now with some cousins, and she is safe, but she is not the same person she was before. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help another woman escape a situation she did not want to be in, I would do it without hesitation. So here we are." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation or grief. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I am so sorry about your sister, and I am grateful beyond words for what you are doing for me. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Philip said firmly. "Just take the time you need to heal and figure out what you want. That is payment enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Margaret felt some of the tension drain from her body. The worst had already happened. She had been abandoned, humiliated, and had run away from her own wedding. There was nowhere to go from here but up, and for the first time since this morning's disaster, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. Philip stood up and moved toward the bedroom door. "Let me get you some clothes. You cannot be comfortable in that dress, and it is too fine for ranch work anyway. I have some things that belong to my sister from when she used to visit. They might be a bit big on you, but they will do until we can figure out something better." He disappeared into the bedroom and returned a few minutes later with a simple cotton dress in pale blue, along with some undergarments and a pair of sturdy boots. "The necessary is out back," he said, his ears turning slightly red as he realized the indelicacy of the subject. "I will step outside while you change. Take your time." Margaret took the clothes gratefully and waited until he had left the cabin before standing up and attempting to undress. The wedding gown had over 24 buttons down the back, buttons that had required Sarah's help to fasten that morning, and Margaret quickly realized she had no hope of reaching them all on her own. She managed to undo the first few, but the rest were simply too high and too tight for her to manage alone. She bit her lip, considering her options, and finally called out, "Mr. Anderson, I am afraid I need some assistance." Philip opened the door cautiously, keeping his eyes averted. "Is everything all right?" "I cannot reach the buttons on the back of this dress," Margaret said, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I am sorry to ask, but could you help me with them? I promise to be quick." Philip cleared his throat and moved behind her, and Margaret felt his fingers, surprisingly gentle for their size, begin to work the tiny pearl buttons free from their loops. He worked slowly and carefully, his touch professional and impersonal. But Margaret found herself acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth of his breath on the back of her neck, of the way her skin tingled where his knuckles occasionally brushed against her spine. "There," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. "You should be able to manage the rest on your own." He retreated quickly, almost fleeing back outside, and Margaret finished undressing with shaking hands. She stepped out of the elaborate gown, and the layers of petticoats beneath it, feeling as though she was shedding not just clothing but an entire identity she no longer wanted to claim. The simple cotton dress slipped over her head easily, and though it was indeed a bit large, it was comfortable and practical in a way her fine dresses never were. The boots fit reasonably well, and when Margaret caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall, she almost did not recognize the woman looking back at her. Without the fancy clothes and elaborate hairstyle, she looked younger, more natural, more like herself than she had in years. She opened the door and found Philip sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the horses in the corral. He turned when he heard her and stood up, his eyes taking in her transformation with an expression she could not quite read. "Much better," he said with a small smile. "You look more comfortable, at least." "I am," Margaret admitted. "Thank you again, for the clothes, for the help, for everything." Philip nodded and gestured toward the barn. "I have work to do with the horses this afternoon. You are welcome to rest inside, or if you would like, you can come with me. Sometimes keeping busy helps when you have a lot on your mind." Margaret considered this and realized she had no desire to be alone with her thoughts right now. "I would like to come with you if you do not mind. I have always liked horses, though I confess I do not know much about training them." Philip's smile widened, reaching his eyes and transforming his serious face into something warmer, more approachable. "Then I will teach you. Come on." They spent the afternoon in the corral, with Philip working with a young gelding that was still learning to accept a saddle and rider. Margaret watched, fascinated, as he moved around the horse with calm confidence, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice, never rushing, never forcing, always waiting for the animal to come to him. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, a patience and understanding that extended beyond just the horses to encompass everything about the way he moved through the world. After a while, Philip called Margaret over and showed her how to approach the horse without startling it, how to read its body language and respond accordingly. He placed her hand on the gelding's neck and guided her through the gentle strokes that would earn the animal's trust, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, into the simple pleasure of connecting with another living creature without words or expectations. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains when they finally finished for the day, and Philip led Margaret back to the cabin to prepare dinner. He was surprisingly skilled in the kitchen, moving with the same easy competence he showed with the horses, and soon the small space was filled with the smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits. They ate at the table, and conversation flowed more easily now, the initial awkwardness of the morning fading into something more comfortable. Philip told her about his work, about the different ranches he worked with and the horses he had trained over the years. Margaret found herself telling him about her own interests, about the books she loved to read and the flower garden she had tended at her father's house. Small things she had almost forgotten about in the rush of wedding preparations and expectations. As the evening wore on and the light faded from the windows, Margaret felt something shift inside her, some fundamental change that she could not quite name. She had started this day expecting to become Mrs. Richard Thornton, to begin a life of wealth and social position and quiet desperation. Instead, she was sitting in a small cabin with a cowboy she barely knew, wearing borrowed clothes and feeling more at peace than she had in months. It was strange and unexpected, and more than a little frightening, but it was also exactly where she needed to be. That night, Margaret lay in the small bedroom Philip had given her, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night outside. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, she could hear the soft movements of the horses in the barn. Philip was sleeping on a bedroll in the main room, having insisted she take the only proper bed, and knowing he was just beyond the door made her feel safe in a way she had not expected. She thought about Richard and Catherine riding toward their new life in California, and realized with some surprise that she did not feel the sharp pain of betrayal anymore. What she felt instead was a strange sense of relief, as though she had been released from a trap she had not fully recognized until it opened. Richard had done her a favor by running away, had given her an escape from a life that would have slowly suffocated her. And Philip, this kind stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment, had given her the courage to actually take that escape. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what her life might look like now. She had no plan, no money, no prospects, but she also had no obligations, no expectations, no one telling her what she should want or who she should be. The future stretched out before her like the Montana landscape, wide open and full of possibilities, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt excited rather than afraid. The next few days fell into an easy rhythm. Margaret helped Philip with the horses, learning more each day about their care and training. She cooked meals and tidied the cabin, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to contribute something to the household that had taken her in so generously. Philip treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, never asking questions she did not want to answer, never pushing her to talk about her feelings or make decisions she was not ready to make. But beneath the comfortable routine, Margaret was increasingly aware of Philip in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or friendship. She noticed the way his hands moved when he worked with the horses, strong and sure and surprisingly gentle. She noticed the sound of his laugh when something amused him, low and warm and genuine. She noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, his eyes holding something that might have been admiration or might have been something deeper. On the fourth day of her stay, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she dropped the sheet she was holding, fear flooding through her. Philip must have heard it too, because he came striding out of the barn, his face set in grim lines, positioning himself between Margaret and the approaching riders. Two men on horseback came into view, and Margaret's stomach sank when she recognized them. One was her father, William Grace, his face red with anger and his posture rigid with barely controlled fury. The other was Sheriff Tom Reynolds, a man Margaret had known since childhood, who looked deeply uncomfortable to be part of this expedition. William dismounted before his horse had fully stopped moving, storming toward the cabin with his fists clenched at his sides. "Margaret and Grace, what in God's name do you think you are doing? Do you have any idea what you have put me through? The humiliation, the gossip, the complete disaster you have made of everything I worked to build." Margaret stepped out from behind Philip, her chin raised despite the fear thrumming through her veins. "Good afternoon, Father. I am sorry if my actions caused you distress, but I think my humiliation was considerably greater than yours." "Distress?" William sputtered, his face going even redder. "You think this is about distress? You ran away from your own wedding with some common cowboy, disappeared without a word, and left me to explain to over 100 guests why the bride had vanished. I have had to deal with Richard's father threatening to pull his business from the bank, with social calls from every busybody in town wanting to know what scandal you have embroiled us in. And you are concerned about your feelings. Philip stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Mr. Grace, with all due respect, your daughter did not run away from her wedding. She ran away from a man who abandoned her at the altar. And she did not run away with me. She ran away and I offered her shelter when she needed it. There is a significant difference. William turned his furious gaze on Philip, looking him up and down with obvious disdain. I do not recall asking for your opinion, Mr. Anderson. This is a family matter and does not concern you. It concerns me when a young woman shows up on my property in distress and asks for help, Philip replied, his tone not wavering. And it concerns me that you seem more worried about your business reputation than about your daughter's well-being. The sheriff, who had been standing quietly by his horse, finally spoke up. William, maybe we should all calm down and discuss this rationally. Margaret is clearly safe and well cared for. Perhaps we should hear what she has to say before we go making accusations and threats. William ignored him, his attention focused entirely on Margaret. You are coming home with me right now. We will deal with this mess you have created, and you will apologize to everyone you have inconvenienced with your childish behavior. Something inside Margaret snapped at those words, some final thread of obedience and deference that had been holding her to her old life. No, she said clearly, and the word hung in the air like a challenge. No, William repeated as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, I am not coming home with you, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I am an adult woman, father, not a child you can order about. And I am not going to apologize for refusing to marry a man who did not want to marry me, or for seeking help when I needed it, or for taking a few days to figure out what I want to do with my life. William's expression went from red to nearly purple. You ungrateful, foolish girl. I have given you everything, provided for you, raised you properly, and this is how you repay me. By shaming our family name and running off with some nobody who lives in a shack and works with horses. That is enough, Philip said, his voice quiet but commanding. You can insult me all you like, Mr. Grace, but you will not speak to your daughter that way, not on my property. Sheriff Reynolds, is there any legal reason why Miss Grace needs to leave with her father today? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Well, no, not really. She is of legal age and has not been accused of any crime. If she does not want to go, I cannot force her. William turned his fury on the sheriff. You are supposed to be upholding the law, Tom. A daughter is supposed to obey her father. Actually, that is not a law, just a social expectation, Sheriff Reynolds said mildly. And given the circumstances, I am inclined to let Miss Grace make her own decisions about where she wants to stay. Margaret could see her father struggling to contain his rage, could see him calculating his options and coming up empty. Finally, he turned back to her, and his expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like pleading, though his voice remained hard. Margaret, be reasonable. You cannot stay here indefinitely. You have no money, no prospects. What do you think is going to happen? This man is not going to take care of you forever out of the goodness of his heart. Come home, and we will figure out a plan for your future that makes sense. I have a plan for my future, Margaret said, though in truth she was making it up as she went along. I am going to stay here and work with Mr. Anderson, learn about horse training and ranch management. He has been kind enough to offer me employment in exchange for room and board, and I have accepted. This was news to Philip. Margaret could tell by the way his eyebrows rose slightly, but to his credit, he did not contradict her, just gave a small nod of confirmation. William stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "You are going to work as a ranch hand. You who have never done a day of manual labor in your life. You who was raised to be a lady of society. This is madness, Margaret, complete madness." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed. "But it is my madness, and I am old enough to make my own mistakes if that is what this turns out to be. I am not coming home, Father. Not now. Maybe not ever. You will simply have to accept that." For a long moment, William just stared at her, and Margaret could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the battle between his desire to control her and his realization that he no longer could. Finally, he drew himself up to his full height and gave her a look of cold disdain. "Very well. If you want to throw away everything I have given you, everything I have worked for, then so be it. But do not come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you have made. You are on your own now, Margaret. I wash my hands of you." He turned and mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, and Sheriff Reynolds followed suit, though not before giving Margaret a look that held both concern and a hint of approval. They rode away without another word, and Margaret watched them go with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had just severed the last tie to her old life, had chosen an uncertain future over the safety of her father's house, and she had no idea if she had made the right decision. Philip waited until the two men were out of sight before turning to her. "Are you all right?" Margaret realized she was shaking, adrenaline coursing through her body now that the confrontation was over. "I do not know," she admitted. "I just told my father I never wanted to go home. I just burned every bridge I had. And I may have volunteered myself for a job without actually asking if you were willing to employ me. I am so sorry. I should have discussed it with you first, but I needed to say something that would make him leave." To her surprise, Philip smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "I would be honored to employ you, Miss Grace. You have already been a great help around here this week, and if you are serious about learning the horse business, I am happy to teach you everything I know. The pay will not be much, but you will have a place to stay and food to eat, and you will learn a trade that can serve you well no matter where you end up." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, truly. I do not know what I did to deserve your kindness, but I swear I will work hard and earn my keep. You will not regret taking a chance on me." "I do not think I will," Philip said softly, and something in his eyes made Margaret's breath catch in her chest. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of Margaret's life. She learned to rise before dawn to help feed the horses, to muck out stalls and repair fences, to read the subtle signs that indicated when a horse was ready to advance in its training and when it needed more time. Her hands, which had been soft from a life of leisure, developed calluses and blisters that eventually hardened into evidence of her new life. Her skin, which had been carefully protected from the sun, took on a healthy glow from hours spent outdoors. And her heart, which had been bruised and battered by Richard's betrayal, slowly began to heal in the quiet peace of the ranch. But more than the work or the surroundings, it was Philip himself who transformed Margaret's understanding of what her life could be. He was patient when she made mistakes, encouraging when she succeeded, and always respectful of her boundaries and her pace of learning. He talked to her about his dreams of expanding the ranch, of breeding horses with specific traits for different types of work, of building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. And slowly, carefully, he began to ask her about her own dreams, about what she wanted from life now that she was free to choose for herself. Margaret found herself opening up to him in ways she had never opened up to anyone, sharing her love of books and learning, her desire to see more of the world beyond Bozeman, her secret hope that she might one day do something meaningful with her life. something that mattered. Philip listened to all of it with genuine interest, never dismissing her dreams as frivolous or impossible. And in return, he shared his own stories, his own past, his own hopes for the future. She learned that he had grown up in Nebraska, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in a drought when Philip was 16. His family had split up, siblings going to live with various relatives while Philip and his father tried to salvage what they could from the farm. When that proved impossible, Philip had gone west, taking whatever work he could find, until he discovered he had a natural talent for understanding and training horses. He had worked for various ranches throughout Wyoming and Montana, saving every penny until he had enough to buy this small piece of land and start his own operation. His dream was to build it into something substantial, to create the kind of stability his family had lost all those years ago. As autumn began to paint the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret realized with a start that she had been living on Philip's ranch for nearly 2 months. The scandal of her abandoned wedding had faded somewhat, replaced by newer gossip and concerns, though she knew people still talked about her when they thought no one was listening. She had received 2 letters from Sarah, both filled with concern and support, letting Margaret know that she was missed and that not everyone in Bozeman thought poorly of her decision to leave. But Margaret had not heard a word from her father, and that silence hurt more than she wanted to admit. She had not expected forgiveness, but she had hoped, in some small part of her heart, that he might eventually reach out, might acknowledge that she had a right to make her own choices even if he did not agree with them. The silence felt like confirmation that she was truly on her own now, that the only family she had was the one she chose to create for herself. One evening in early October, Margaret and Philip were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to the evening chorus of crickets and frogs from the creek. The air had turned cool with the promise of the coming winter, and Margaret had wrapped herself in a heavy shawl Philip had given her. "Winter will be here soon," Philip said, his voice thoughtful. "We will need to make sure we have enough hay stored for the horses, and I need to check the roof of the barn before the snow comes. It leaked a bit last year, and I do not want to deal with that again." Margaret nodded, mentally adding those tasks to the growing list of things that needed to be done before the weather turned truly cold. "I can help with the hay, and I am fairly handy with a hammer if you need assistance with the roof repairs." Philip smiled at that. "You have become quite the ranch hand, Miss Grace. I am impressed by how much you have learned in such a short time." "I have a good teacher," Margaret said, and she meant it. Philip had a gift for explaining things in a way that made sense, for breaking down complex tasks into manageable steps. Working with him had taught her not just about horses, but about patience, about persistence, about the satisfaction that came from doing hard work well. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Philip cleared his throat, his posture shifting slightly in a way that suggested he had something on his mind. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can answer honestly without worrying about offending me or jeopardizing your position here." Margaret turned to look at him, curiosity and a hint of concern mixing in her chest. "All right, what is it?" Philip met her eyes, and in the fading light, his expression was open and vulnerable in a way she had not seen before. "What are your plans for the future? I know you have been working here to earn your keep and figure things out, but we have never really talked about what comes next for you. Are you planning to stay in Montana? Go somewhere else? Try to reconcile with your father? I just need to know so I can plan accordingly for the ranch." Margaret felt her heart start to beat faster because she knew this was a question she had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. "Honestly, I do not know. I had not really thought beyond getting through each day. Why do you ask? Philip looked away, his jaw working as though he was struggling with what to say next. Because I need to know if you are going to stay, not just as an employee but as something more. Because over these past 2 months, you have become more to me than just someone working on my ranch. You have become someone I look forward to seeing every morning, someone I think about when I should be focused on other things, someone I cannot imagine my life without anymore. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had felt the growing connection between them, had noticed the way her heart lifted whenever he smiled at her, the way his touch seemed to linger just a moment longer than necessary when he helped her with a difficult task. But she had told herself she was imagining it, that he was just being kind to someone who had needed help. The possibility that he might feel the same way she was beginning to feel had seemed too good to be true. "Philip," she said softly, and she saw him wince slightly at the uncertainty in her tone. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I should not have said anything. You have been through so much, and the last thing you need is me putting pressure on you or making things complicated. Please forget I said anything." "No," Margaret said firmly, and she reached out to take his hand, lacing her fingers through his calloused ones. "Do not apologize. I am glad you said something because I have been feeling the same way, but I did not know if it was appropriate to say so. You saved me, Philip. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. You treated me with respect and kindness when everyone else saw me as a scandal or a problem to be solved. How could I not develop feelings for you?" Philip's eyes widened, and then he was pulling her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "You are sure? Because I need you to be absolutely sure, Margaret. I do not want you to feel obligated to me because I helped you, or because you think you have no other options. If we are going to do this, if we are going to be together, it has to be because you want it as much as I do." Margaret leaned into his touch, her eyes locked with his. "I want it. I want you. These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life, even with all the uncertainty and difficulty. When I think about my future now, the only image that comes to mind is this ranch, these horses, and you. I do not want to go anywhere else or be with anyone else. I am sure, Philip. I am absolutely sure." For a moment, Philip just looked at her, his eyes searching her face as though trying to memorize every detail. Then he leaned in and kissed her, gentle and tentative at first, giving her the chance to pull away if she wanted to. But Margaret did not want to pull away. She kissed him back with all the feelings she had been holding inside, all the hope and affection and growing love that had been building since that first terrible day when he had offered her his hand and a way out. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident as they learned the shape and taste of each other, as Philip's arms came around her and pulled her close against his chest. Margaret felt as though she was coming home to a place she had never known existed, a place of safety and passion and perfect rightness that made everything she had gone through to get here worthwhile. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Philip rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I have wanted to do that for weeks now. Every time you smiled at me or laughed at something I said, I wanted to pull you close and kiss you senseless. But I did not want to scare you away or make you think I had only helped you because I wanted something in return." "You could never scare me away," Margaret said with certainty. "And I know you helped me because you are a good man, not because you expected anything. That is part of why I fell for you. You are everything Richard was not: honest, kind, hardworking, and genuinely good." Philip pulled back slightly so he could look at her properly. "Marry me, Margaret. I know it is fast. I know we have not been courting in any traditional sense, but I do not care about tradition. I care about you. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to build this ranch with you, build a future with you. Say yes." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, joyful tears, tears of someone who had gone from the worst day of her life to the best day in the span of just a few months. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Phillip Anderson. Nothing would make me happier." They kissed again, and this time there was a sense of promise in it, of commitment and future and all the possibilities that lay ahead. When they finally went inside, hand in hand, Margaret felt as though she was floating, as though her heart was too full to be contained in her chest. She had come to this ranch broken and lost, and somehow, against all odds, she had found exactly what she needed: a place to belong, work that mattered, and a man who loved her for who she really was. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the same church where Margaret was supposed to have married Richard. Sheriff Reynolds stood up as Philip's witness, and Sarah came with her family to stand with Margaret, tears of happiness streaming down her face as she watched her friend marry a man who truly deserved her. The ceremony was simple, with none of the elaborate decorations or grand guest list that had marked the first attempted wedding. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, mostly Philip's friends and business associates, along with Sarah and her family. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, having heard the full story and approving wholeheartedly of the match. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Philip kissed Margaret with such tender passion that several of the guests cheered, and Margaret felt her heart soar with pure happiness. The one shadow on the day was the continued absence of Margaret's father. She had written to him to inform him of her engagement and upcoming marriage, hoping that he might unbend enough to attend or at least offer his blessing. But she had received no response, and when she scanned the small crowd in the church, she saw no sign of him. It hurt, but Margaret tried not to let it dampen her joy. She had chosen her path, and Philip was her family now. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the ranch, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Margaret wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool that Sarah had helped her sew, practical and pretty in equal measure. Philip could not seem to stop smiling, his hand never far from Margaret's, his eyes constantly seeking her out in the crowd. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Margaret found herself alone with Philip on the porch once again, the same spot where he had first confessed his feelings for her. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, and Margaret could hear the horses moving softly in the barn, settling down for the night. "Happy?" Philip asked, pulling her close against his side. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret said honestly. "When Richard left me at the altar, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be able to show my face in public again, never be anything other than the woman who was not good enough. But he gave me the greatest gift, even though he did not mean to. He set me free to find you, to find this life. I would not change a single thing about how we got here." Philip kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Neither would I. Though if I ever see Richard Thornton again, I might have to thank him for being stupid enough to let you go." Margaret laughed, leaning back to look up at her husband, still marveling at the fact that she could call him that. "Or you could just punch him for hurting me in the first place. I would be all right with either option." "I like the way you think, Mrs. Anderson," Philip said with a grin, and then he scooped her up in his arms, making her shriek with surprised laughter. "Now, I believe it is time for me to carry my bride over the threshold of our home." He carried her inside the cabin that was now theirs, both of theirs, and kicked the door shut behind them. The fire in the hearth cast warm shadows across the walls, and Margaret felt a sense of profound peace settle over her. This was where she belonged. This was home. Their first months as a married couple were filled with hard work and deep contentment. Winter came to Montana with its usual force, blanketing the landscape in snow and testing their preparations. But the roof held, the hay lasted, and the horses stayed healthy and strong. Margaret and Philip worked side by side every day, their partnership extending beyond their personal relationship into every aspect of ranch life. They made decisions together, planned for the future together, and faced challenges together, their bond growing stronger with each passing week. In the spring, they received unexpected news that would change their financial situation considerably. One of the colts Philip had trained and sold the previous year had gone on to win several important races, and the new owner was eager to purchase more horses from the same bloodline. The money from those sales allowed them to expand the ranch, to buy more breeding stock, and to hire a part-time hand to help with the heavier work. The business began to thrive in ways Philip had only dreamed about, and Margaret discovered she had a real talent for the business side of things, for keeping records and negotiating sales and managing their finances. Sarah visited regularly, her friendship with Margaret having survived the scandal and grown even stronger. She confided in Margaret that she was courting a young doctor who had recently moved to Bozeman, and Margaret was delighted to return the support and advice that Sarah had given her during those dark days after Richard's betrayal. But there was still one relationship that remained broken, one wound that refused to heal. Margaret had written to her father several times over the first year of her marriage, attempting to build a bridge across the chasm that separated them. She told him about the ranch, about her work with the horses, about how happy she was with Philip. But every letter went unanswered, and eventually, Margaret stopped writing, accepting with sadness that her father had meant what he said when he told her he was washing his hands of her. It was Sarah who finally brought news of William Grace, arriving at the ranch one afternoon in late summer with a troubled expression. She and Margaret sat on the porch with glasses of cool water while Philip worked in the corral, and Sarah took Margaret's hand before speaking. "I need to tell you something about your father," Sarah said gently. "He has been ill for several months now. Nothing immediately dangerous, but his heart is weak, and the doctor says he needs to reduce his stress and workload. He has been asking about you, Margaret. He has not said so directly, but my mother has been visiting him regularly, and she says he keeps your letters in his desk drawer, that he takes them out and reads them when he thinks no one is watching. I think he regrets the way things ended between you, but he is too proud to admit it." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. Part of her wanted to be angry, to point out that her father had had plenty of opportunities to reach out and had chosen not to. But another part of her, the part that remembered the man who had read her stories when she was little and taught her to appreciate the beauty of numbers and logic, felt only sadness for the time they had lost. "What do you think I should do?" Margaret asked. "I think you should go see him," Sarah said softly. "Not because you have to and not because you owe him anything, but because I think you will regret it if you do not, if something happens to him and you never had the chance to make peace. You have built such a wonderful life here, Margaret. You have found happiness and success on your own terms. Maybe seeing that will help him understand that his fears about your future were unfounded." Margaret talked it over with Philip that evening, and he, as always, supported whatever decision she wanted to make. "He is your father," Philip said simply. "And from what you have told me, he was not always as rigid and controlling as he became in later years. Maybe illness has given him perspective on what truly matters. If you want to try to reconcile with him, I will be right beside you." And so, the next day, Margaret and Philip rode into Bozeman together, making the journey that Margaret had not undertaken since the day she ran away from her wedding. The town looked the same but felt different, or perhaps it was Margaret herself who was different. She was no longer the anxious, people-pleasing woman who had been willing to marry a man she did not love just to fulfill her father's expectations. She was Margaret Anderson now, a successful horse trainer and ranch manager, a woman who had built a life on her own terms and found true happiness in the process. They stopped first at the bank where her father kept his office, but were told he was working from home now due to his health. Margaret's childhood home looked exactly as she remembered it, a large two-story house on the main street with a wide porch and carefully tended flower beds. Her mother's roses were blooming, and Margaret felt a pang of sadness that her mother was not here to see how things had turned out. Philip squeezed her hand before they knocked on the door. "I am right here," he said. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Margaret nodded and knocked. A housekeeper she did not recognize answered, and Margaret asked to see her father. The woman looked surprised but nodded and showed them into the parlor, a room Margaret had spent countless hours in during her youth, practicing her needlework and reading books, and trying to be the perfect daughter her parents wanted. William Grace appeared a few minutes later, moving slowly and looking older than Margaret remembered. His face had grown thinner, and there was a grayness to his skin that spoke of ill health. But his eyes were still sharp, and they widened when he saw Margaret standing in his parlor, her hand clasped in Philip's. For a long moment no one spoke. Then William cleared his throat and gestured to the chairs. "Please, sit down." They sat, and an awkward silence fell over the room. Finally, Margaret broke it, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "Sarah told me you have been unwell. I wanted to come see you to talk if you are willing." William settled into his own chair, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed the support. "I am glad you came," he said, his voice rough. "I have wanted to reach out for months now, but I did not know how. I said such terrible things to you that day at the ranch, things I did not truly mean but spoke in anger and wounded pride." "You hurt me, Father," Margaret said honestly. "You made me feel as though your business reputation was more important than my happiness or well-being. You tried to force me into a marriage that would have made me miserable, and when I chose a different path, you cut me out of your life completely." William nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to his hands. "You are right. About all of it. I was so focused on what I thought your life should be, on securing your future in the way I understood security, that I failed to see what you actually needed. And when you defied me, when you chose your own path, I took it as a personal insult rather than recognizing it as the act of courage it was." He looked up at Philip then, his gaze assessing. "I was wrong about you too, Mr. Anderson. I dismissed you as a common cowboy, beneath my daughter's station. But I have heard things around town this past year. I know your ranch is thriving, that you are known as one of the best horse trainers in the territory, that you treat my daughter with respect and kindness. I judged you without knowing you, and I apologize for that." Philip inclined his head. "I appreciate that, Mr. Grace. Though I will tell you honestly, I did not pursue Margaret to prove anything to you or anyone else in this town. I pursued her because she is intelligent, capable, and one of the finest people I have ever known. She makes me want to be a better man, and I wake up every day grateful that she chose to build a life with me." William's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "She is all those things and more. I see that now. I just wish I had seen it a year ago, before I drove her away with my pride and stubbornness." Margaret felt her own tears rising. "I do not want to dwell on the past anymore, Father. What is done is done. But if you are truly sorry, if you truly want to be part of my life again, then I am willing to try. To start fresh and see if we can build a relationship that is based on mutual respect rather than obligation and control." William stood up, moving slowly, and crossed to where Margaret sat. He held out his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, She took it. He pulled her to her feet and embraced her, the first time he had hugged her in years, and Margaret felt something break open inside her. All the hurt and anger and longing she had been carrying finally finding release. "I am so proud of you," William whispered into her hair. "So proud of the woman you have become, of the life you have built. Your mother would be proud too. She always said you had more steel in your spine than anyone gave you credit for." They talked for hours that afternoon, clearing the air and beginning the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. William told them about his health issues, about how facing his own mortality had given him perspective on what truly mattered. He asked about the ranch, about their plans for the future, and listened with genuine interest as Margaret and Philip described their work and their dreams. Before they left, William went to his desk and pulled out a document he had drawn up. "I have been meaning to send this to you, but I kept waiting for the right moment. It is a portion of your mother's inheritance, money that was set aside for you years ago but that I withheld after our falling out. It is yours, Margaret, always has been. Use it to expand the ranch, or save it for the future, or do whatever you see fit. No strings attached." Margaret took the document with shaking hands, scanning the amount and feeling her eyes widen. It was a substantial sum, enough to make a real difference in their operations. "Father, I do not know what to say." "Say you will come visit again," William replied. "Say you will let me be part of your life, even if only in a small way. That is all I ask." Margaret hugged him again. "Yes, I will come visit, we both will. You are family and family matters." The ride back to the ranch that evening felt lighter somehow, as though a weight Margaret had not fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. Philip could tell she was processing a lot of emotions, and he gave her space to think, his quiet presence a comfort as always. "Thank you for coming with me today," Margaret said as their house came into view in the distance. "I do not think I could have done it without you." "You could have," Philip said with certainty. "You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, Margaret, but I am glad I was there. I am glad I get to be part of all of it, the hard parts and the good parts." That night, as they lay in bed together, Margaret told Philip something she had been suspecting for a few weeks, but had not yet confirmed. "I think I might be pregnant." Philip went very still beside her, and then he rolled over to look at her, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Truly? You are sure?" "Not entirely sure yet, but fairly certain. All the signs are there. If I am right, the baby would come sometime in late winter or early spring." A slow smile spread across Philip's face, and then he was laughing and pulling her into his arms, kissing her face and telling her how happy he was, how loved she was, how perfect this all was. And Margaret, held safe in her husband's embrace, felt complete in a way she had never felt before. This was her life now. This man, this ranch, this growing family. Everything she had lost when Richard abandoned her at the altar had led her here, to this perfect moment, to this perfect love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Margaret continued to work on the ranch as long as she was able, only reluctantly stepping back from the more physically demanding tasks in her final months. Philip was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about whether she was doing too much or not getting enough rest. Margaret found his concern endearing, even when it sometimes drove her a bit crazy. William visited several times during the pregnancy, his health having stabilized with proper medical care and reduced stress. He and Philip developed a cautious but genuine friendship, bonding over their shared love for Margaret and their interest in horses. William even invested a significant sum in the ranch, becoming a silent partner in the business and taking pride in its continued success. In March of 1884, on a cold but clear morning, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town, and with Philip pacing anxiously in the main room of the cabin. When the midwife finally called him in to meet his son, Philip approached the bed with trembling hands and tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Philip whispered, carefully taking the tiny bundle from Margaret's arms and cradling him with infinite gentleness. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas William Anderson, honoring both the sheriff who had stood by them and Margaret's father who had found his way back into their lives. Thomas had Philip's gray-blue eyes and a full head of dark hair, and from the first moment he entered the world, he seemed determined to make his presence known with healthy, vigorous cries. William came to visit a week after the birth, bringing gifts and offering awkward but heartfelt congratulations. Watching her father hold his grandson for the first time, seeing the tears in his eyes and the gentleness in his touch, Margaret felt the last lingering hurt from their estrangement finally fade away. They had both made mistakes, both been too proud and stubborn, but they had found their way back to each other. That was what mattered. The years that followed were full of joy and hard work in equal measure. The ranch continued to grow and prosper, gaining a reputation throughout Montana Territory and beyond for producing horses of exceptional quality and temperament. Margaret proved to have a keen eye for bloodlines and a talent for matching horses with the right buyers, and she became as respected in the horse community as Philip himself. Thomas grew from an infant into a curious, energetic toddler who loved following his parents around the ranch and helping with whatever tasks they were engaged in. When he was 3 years old, he became a big brother to twin girls, Emma and Lillian, who inherited their mother's dark hair and their father's smile. The cabin became too small for their growing family, and Philip spent a year building a larger house with the help of hired workers, a beautiful home with room for all of them and guest rooms for the visitors who now regularly made their way to the Anderson Ranch. Sarah married her doctor and remained Margaret's closest friend, their children growing up together and forming bonds that would last a lifetime. William Grace lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren, his health holding steady until he passed peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 67, content in the knowledge that his daughter was happy and successful beyond anything he had imagined for her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Philip and Margaret stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains as they had done so many times before. The ranch sprawled out before them, testament to a decade of hard work and shared dreams. Their children's laughter drifted from inside the house, where they were playing a game with the ranch hand's daughter who often came to visit. "You ever think about that day?" Philip asked, his arm around Margaret's waist. "The day you ran away from your wedding?" Margaret leaned into him, smiling. "Sometimes, but not with sadness or regret. That was the day my real life began, the day I stopped letting fear and other people's expectations dictate my choices. Richard did me the biggest favor anyone ever has, even though he did not mean to. He set me free to find you." "I was so nervous that morning," Philip admitted. "I had gone to the church to talk to Reverend Matthews about a matter that seemed important at the time, though I cannot even remember what it was now. And then you came out that side door in your wedding dress, looking so lost and heartbroken, and all I wanted to do was help you somehow. I had no idea that decision would change my entire life." "Changed both our lives," Margaret said, "for the better. I sometimes wonder where I would be now if I had gone through with that wedding, if I had married Richard and spent my life pretending to be happy. I cannot even imagine it anymore. This life, this ranch, our children, this is the only reality that matters." Philip turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face the way he had that first night he kissed her. "I love you, Margaret Anderson, more today than the day I married you, and I will love you even more tomorrow. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Margaret said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "My cowboy who was waiting outside the church, my rescuer, my partner, my love." They stood there as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had built a life together on a foundation of mutual respect, trust, and deep, abiding love. The path that had brought them together had been painful and difficult, but neither would have changed a moment of it, because every hardship had led them to this place, to this family, to this perfect life they had created together. Inside the house, Thomas called for them, wanting to show them something he had built with his blocks. Emma was singing one of the nonsense songs she loved to make up, and Lillian was probably trying to follow along. The dishes from dinner needed washing, and there were a dozen small tasks that would fill their evening before they finally settled into bed, tired but content. Margaret took Philip's hand and led him back inside, back to the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of their family. She had been abandoned at the altar by a man who never deserved her, and had been rescued by a cowboy who was waiting outside the church. That moment of betrayal had led her to this lifetime of love, and she would be grateful for it every single day for the rest of her life. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch became one of the most successful operations in Montana, drawing buyers from as far away as California and Texas. Thomas grew into a fine young man who shared his parents' love of horses and eventually took over much of the day-to-day training operations. Emma developed a talent for breeding strategy and bloodline management that even exceeded Margaret's considerable skills. Lillian surprised everyone by showing more interest in the business and sales side of things, traveling throughout the territory to meet with buyers and negotiate deals. Margaret and Philip grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work, but their love never dimming. They sat on their porch on summer evenings, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren, telling stories of the old days and watching the sun set over the mountains they loved. And sometimes, when they were alone, Margaret would tell the story of how they met, about the worst day of her life that led to the best life she could have imagined. She would talk about standing outside that church in her wedding dress, broken and lost, and about the cowboy who offered his hand and showed her that there was another way forward, a better way, a way that led to true happiness. Philip would hold her hand and add his own memories to the story, about the beautiful woman in white who appeared like a vision, about the instant recognition he felt that this person was going to change everything, about the moment he knew he was falling in love and there was no going back. Their children and grandchildren never tired of hearing the story, never stopped being amazed by the courage it had taken for Margaret to walk away from her old life, and the kindness it had taken for Philip to help a stranger in need. It became part of the family legacy, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life are actually the beginning of something beautiful, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that true happiness comes from following your heart rather than other people's expectations. Margaret Grace Anderson lived to the age of 78, surrounded by her family, having built a legacy that extended far beyond the successful ranch she and Philip created. She lived long enough to see Montana become a state in 1889, to see automobiles begin to appear on the roads, to see the world change in ways she never could have imagined that morning in 1883, when she ran away from her wedding. And in all those years, through all those changes, the one constant was the love she shared with Philip, the cowboy who had waited outside the church at exactly the right moment, who had offered her a hand when she needed it most, and who had given her a life more wonderful than any fairy tale. It was a love story for the ages, born from heartbreak and blossoming into something beautiful, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and the belief that it is never too late to choose a different path, to find true love, to create the life you were always meant to live.